A city's streets form a perfect grid, every brick identical to the next. We think of such order as modern, the product of machines and factories. Yet this scene comes from a civilization over 4,000 years old. This is the central mystery of ancient standardization. While mass production defines our industrial age, archaeologists keep finding astonishingly precise uniformity in cities built millennia before the assembly line. Why would pre-industrial societies, without any machinery or technical blueprints, impose such rigid sameness on everything from tools and buildings to the very rhythms of daily life? By the end of this exploration, you will see how this phenomenon forces us to rewrite the story of human progress. It reveals a forgotten kind of intelligence, where social organization achieved what we thought only technology could. How did ancient rulers enforce perfect brick dimensions across hundreds of miles? What world view could make uniformity a sacred duty? The answers challenge everything we assume about so-called primitive societies. They mastered a powerful, double-edged tool we still use today. What does our own drive for perfect order say about us? This was not the result of a single artisan perfecting their craft. It was a system. Ancient standardization meant a central authority deciding that every single brick across every single construction site for an entire city or even an empire would be exactly the same size, shape, and weight. It meant pottery workshops, sometimes separated by hundreds of miles, producing jars with identical capacities, down to a fraction of a liter. It meant streets intersecting at perfect right angles, laid out according to a master plan that ignored the natural contours of the land. To understand the scale of this achievement, we have to look at what normal handcrafting produces. When a potter works alone, each pot carries subtle fingerprints of the process. The rim might be a little wider on one, the base a bit thicker on another. This natural variation is the hallmark of human touch. What archaeologists find in these early planned cities is the absence of that variation. They uncover thousands of mud bricks, and when measured, their dimensions are unnervingly consistent, as if stamped from a single mold that did not yet exist. They find administrative records not just listing quantities of grain, but specifying the exact standardized vessel that grain must be stored and transported in. This shift from individual creation to systematic output is profound. It represents a leap from making things to manufacturing them, long before the word factory entered our vocabulary. The question then becomes not how they made one perfect brick, but how they convinced or compelled thousands of workers to make 1,000,000 perfect copies. What kind of society views such uniformity not as a limitation, but as the highest form of order? That commitment to a uniform template reached its zenith in a civilization that remains one of history's great enigmas. In the vast floodplains of the Indus River, a society flourished for nearly 2,000 years, from around 3,300 to 1,300 before the Common Era. What they left behind is not a record of colossal pyramids or warrior kings, but something arguably more sophisticated, a silent testament to their core philosophy. The cities of the Indus Valley, most famously Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were masterpieces of premeditated order. Their most iconic innovation was the brick. Not just any brick, but a kiln-fired, perfectly proportioned building block used in every single structure, from the grandest bathhouse to the most modest home. The ratio was almost always 4:2:1, length to width to height. This was not a suggestion, it was the rule. Imagine the logistical feat. Across hundreds of miles, different groups of workers, using local clay and fuel, were producing millions of these bricks to the same exact specification. A brick made in Mohenjo-daro would fit seamlessly into a wall in Harappa, over 300 miles away. this standardization extended to the very skeleton of the city. Streets were laid out in a precise grid pattern, with main avenues running north-south and east-west, intersecting at perfect right angles. Beneath those streets ran a complex, uniform drainage system, with covered channels and inspection points, ensuring sanitation for the entire urban population. But the uniformity went deeper than city planning. Archaeologists have unearthed tiny stone cubes, exquisitely carved, used as weights. These weights follow a strict standardized system, doubling in a precise progression from small fractions to larger units. The same weight found in a merchant's stall in one city is identical to one found in a distant port town. This reveals a society where commerce, construction, and daily life were all governed by a shared, unspoken agreement on measurement. This was not merely advanced engineering. It was a society-wide cultural code. The consistency is so profound, so embedded in every artifact, that it points to a powerful central idea, a belief that harmony and function were achieved through sameness. The great mystery of the Indus Valley is not how they built these cities, but what kind of social mind could conceive and maintain such flawless standardization across a civilization the size of Western Europe, and for centuries without any evidence of emperors or grand armies to enforce it. What force other than brute power could align the actions of so many people so perfectly? The Indus Valley's silent consensus stands in stark contrast to another ancient powerhouse where standardization roared with the voice of a god-king. In ancient Egypt, uniformity was not just a practical tool, it was a sacred duty, the very mechanism for holding the universe together. This was standardization wielded by a bureaucratic machine of unparalleled scale, where every identical brick and every measured ration was a prayer for cosmic stability. The state's reach was total, and it expressed its power through meticulous sameness. To build a pyramid, you needed more than stone, you needed a system. Millions of limestone blocks quarried from different sites along the Nile had to fit together with hairline precision. This was achieved through the universal application of the royal cubit, a standardized measuring rod made of wood or stone. Official cubit rods, often inscribed with the pharaoh's name, were the sacred templates distributed to overseers across the kingdom. A cubit measured from Thebes had to be exactly the same as a cubit from Memphis. This ensured that every architect, every foreman, and every stonecutter was literally on the same page, building not just a tomb, but a perfect geometric mountain that would channel the pharaoh's ascent to the stars. This drive for uniformity extended far beyond grand monuments. The state administered daily life through a vast bureaucracy of scribes who recorded everything in standardized formats. Workers on the royal tombs received identical daily rations of bread and beer, measured in standardized vessels. Even the production of small religious items, like the millions of blue faience Ushabti figurines meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife, followed strict templates. These were not unique works of art, they were mass-produced spiritual tools, each one an identical component in a ritual system. The underlying philosophy was Mat, a concept encompassing truth, justice, and the fundamental order of the cosmos. Chaos was the ultimate enemy. By imposing perfect, repeatable order on the physical world through standardized weights, measures, and forms, the Egyptian state was performing a continuous act of cosmic maintenance. They were aligning human creation with divine principle. A crooked wall or an uneven ration wasn't just poor craftsmanship, it was a tiny tear in the fabric of reality, a tilt toward disorder. So standardization became a religious and political imperative, a way for the pharaoh, as the living god, to project his power and ensure the sun would rise again tomorrow. The system was so effective, so deeply embedded in ideology, that it sustained one of history's most stable civilizations for 3,000 years. But what happens when this drive for order is applied not to bricks or bread, but to human beings themselves? While Egypt built with stone for the gods, another civilization was building with clay for the ledger. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Mesopotamians faced a problem of scale, not with pyramids but with paperwork. Their great innovation was not the brick but the tablet, and they used it to standardize something even more abstract, thought itself. The medium was simple, mud from the riverbanks pressed into a palm-sized rectangle. But the system they built upon it was revolutionary. Every administrator, from the granaries of Ur to the merchant houses of Babylon, used the same size and shape of tablet. Upon this uniform canvas they pressed marks with a reed stylus, creating the world's first written script, cuneiform. This was not free-form writing, it was a rigid, standardized code. Hundreds of distinct wedge-shaped signs represented syllables, numbers, and commodities. Learning this system required years of scribble school, where students practiced copying the exact same signs, the same lists of words, the same formulas, generation after generation. This created a shared operating language for an entire civilization. But the true power of the system lay in what they wrote, not just how they wrote it. The content itself became standardized. A contract for the sale of a field followed a precise formula with the same legal phrases, witness lists, and curse clauses against any who would break it, whether drawn up in Uruk or Lagash. An inventory of temple sheep was not a descriptive paragraph. It was a table with standardized columns for number, type, and responsible shepherd. Even personal letters began with a rigid formula, say to so and so, thus says so and so, before any actual message. This bureaucratic uniformity turned information into a controllable, fungible commodity for the first time in history. A priest in one city could instantly understand the grain report from a storehouse 50 miles away because it looked exactly like the reports on his own shelves. A merchant could enforce a contract in a foreign city-state's court because the document adhered to a recognized legal template. This network of predictable paperwork enabled the management of vast temple and palace economies that fed thousands, coordinated labor for massive irrigation projects, and facilitated trade across hundreds of miles. It was an information technology that made complex society possible by making reality itself something that could be measured, recorded, and filed away in an archive of identical clay rectangles. The system was so effective it begs a deeper question: what is the true cost of such perfect, legible order? When everything from a marriage contract to a harvest tally must fit a predetermined form, what gets left out of the record? What human stories were never pressed into the clay? The clay tablets of Mesopotamia standardized thought, but another ancient institution found even greater power in standardizing destruction. The battlefield, with its urgent demands of scale and reliability, became one of history's most potent engines for industrial thinking. Nowhere is this more visually stunning than in the silent ranks of China's terracotta army. Guarding the tomb of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, are over 8,000 life-sized ceramic soldiers, each one unique in its facial features. Yet look closer and you see a masterpiece of modular production. Their armor, their weapons, even the components of their hands and torsos were not sculpted individually from whole blocks of clay. They were mass-produced from a limited set of standardized molds. Arms, legs, torsos, and heads were created separately in workshops, then assembled and given individualized details. The real revelation came not from the figures themselves, but from the thousands of real bronze weapons buried with them. Crossbow triggers with multiple interlocking parts were so precisely made that components from one trigger could be swapped with those from another and still function perfectly. Spearheads and arrowheads show near identical dimensions, their lethal tips and sockets manufactured to a universal specification. This was not artisanal weapon-making, it was an armory operating with interchangeable parts over 2,000 years before the concept revolutionized modern industry. The Qin dynasty's military dominance was built on this logistical miracle, enabling them to equip vast, conscripted armies with reliable, uniform gear. This principle was a global military truth. The Roman legion's strength lay not just in the bravery of its soldiers, but in the predictability of its kit. Every legionary from Britain to Syria carried the same type of shield, the same pattern of sword, and wore armor constructed from standardized iron plates or chainmail rings. A soldier could lose his gladius on campaign and be issued an identical replacement from a supply depot. A broken scutum shield could be repaired with components that fit any other shield in the century. This uniformity turned soldiers into interchangeable components of a larger machine, capable of performing complex battlefield maneuvers because every man knew the reach of his neighbor's weapon and the protection offered by his shield. Similarly, the formidable Assyrian war machine relied on standardized chariots, siege engines, and arrowheads, produced in royal workshops to ensure quality and ease of repair in the field. The true innovation was logistical. An army marches on its stomach, as the saying goes, but it also marches on standardized sandals, standardized tents, and standardized measures of grain. Victory often went to the force that could most efficiently produce, transport, and replace the material of war. The battlefield, therefore, demanded a mindset we associate with factories long before factories existed. It required planners to think in terms of units, quotas, and replacement parts, of reducing the chaos of combat to a manageable system of supply and repair. In seeking to master the chaos of war, these ancient commanders inadvertently pioneered a philosophy of production that would one day build the modern world. But if standardization could forge empires and equip armies, what was its ultimate purpose for the rulers who wielded it? What deeper human craving were they attempting to satisfy? Standardization's true power was not in building monuments or winning battles, but in filling storehouses. For any ancient state to survive, it needed to feed its people, pay its soldiers, and fund its ambitions. This required a predictable flow of wealth from the countryside to the center, a process riddled with opportunities for confusion and deceit. The solution was a simple, brilliant tool, a universal language of measurement. Across the ancient world, from the banks of the Nile to the plains of Mesopotamia, authorities established official units, the mina for weight, the deben for copper, the standardized bushel for grain. On the surface, these standards enabled fair trade in the marketplace. A merchant in Babylon could trust that the mina weight used to measure his silver was the same as the one used in a distant city. But the state's primary interest was not fairness between merchants, it was control over its own revenue. Imagine a tax collector arriving at a farming village. His duty is to collect a portion of the harvest as the kingdoms do. Without a standard measure, every transaction is a negotiation. Is the local chieftain's basket the same size as the one used in the next valley? Is the farmer's handful of grain being judged fairly? This ambiguity breeds dispute, resentment, and most damaging to the state, loss of precious resources. Now imagine that same collector carrying an official royal measure, a sealed clay vessel or a bronze weight stamped with the king's insignia. He declares the tax is 10 such measures per field. Suddenly, the obligation is clear, objective, and enforceable. The farmer may grumble at the amount, but he cannot argue with the scale. This system of uniform weights and measures turned the messy, organic wealth of the land, wool, barley, olive oil, into neat, countable units. It reduced what economists call transaction costs, the friction and effort of every exchange. More crucially, it drastically reduced fraud, both by local elites who might underreport their wealth and by corrupt officials who might skim from the top. The state could now calculate with startling precision exactly how much surplus it could extract from its territory. This extracted wealth flowed into vast state granaries and treasuries, which were themselves models of standardized efficiency. In the palace complexes of Mesopotamia or Egypt, row upon row of identical cylindrical storage jars, each holding a known quantity, lined the walls. Scribes used standardized accounting tablets to track every jar's contents, its source, and its destination, whether for feeding laborers, brewing ritual beer, or issuing as rations. This bureaucratic machinery transformed grain into power. It allowed a central authority to amass a surplus large enough to withstand famine, to embark on colossal building projects that employed thousands, and to redistribute food to secure the loyalty of the population. The standard measure, therefore, was more than a tool of commerce. It was the fundamental technology of economic control. It made an entire kingdom legible to its rulers, turning a complex landscape of people and production into a simplified, manageable ledger. But this very act of simplification, of reducing life to standardized units, came with a profound and often invisible cost. What was lost when a harvest or a person's labor became just another number on a clay tablet? The ledger of standardized measures did more than count grain, it counted people. And to manage a population most effectively, you must first design its world. This is where the philosophy of uniformity moved from the granary and the armory into the very homes people lived in, creating a built environment that made social order as visible and unchanging as a brick wall. In the planned cities of antiquity, architecture became a language, and its most common word was repetition. Nowhere is this clearer than in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina in Egypt. This was a settlement built to house the artisans constructing the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not slaves but skilled, valued laborers. Yet their homes, while comfortable, followed a strict, identical template. Row upon row of narrow, rectangular houses were laid out along a straight street. Each home had the same internal layout: a front room, a main living space, a smaller rear room, and a cellar. The dimensions varied only slightly. Walking down that street, you would see the same doorway, the same window placement, repeated dozens of times. This was efficiency in its purest form, a housing solution for a vital state workforce, but it was also a powerful social signal. Your place in the hierarchy was literally set in stone, and for a worker at Deir el-Medina, that place was standardized. Contrast this with the architecture of power. A few miles away, the pharaoh's palace or a noble's villa sprawled in unique, asymmetrical luxury, with gardens, pools, and rooms designed for specific ceremonies. Its grandeur was a one-of-a-kind statement. The worker's house was a copy, a component. This pattern echoes in the Indus Valley cities. The lower towns where the majority lived featured blocks of remarkably uniform houses. They shared similar layouts built with those famous standardized bricks and were connected to the same municipal drainage system. Yet in some of these cities, archaeologists have identified a separate, raised area, often called a citadel. Here, the architecture breaks from the pattern. Buildings are larger, more complex, and arranged differently. The message was built into the cityscape itself. The social pyramid had a physical shape. The repetitive, cookie-cutter design of common housing served several profound purposes for those in authority. First, it made the population legible. Just as a scribe could quickly tally identical jars in a storeroom, an official could survey a neighborhood of identical houses and understand it at a glance. It simplified administration, tax collection, and control. Second, it physically reinforced social categories. You lived in a type of house that corresponded to your station. There was no ambiguity. This limited social mobility by making status visible and permanent in the urban fabric. Finally, and perhaps most subtly, it constrained individual expression. When every house on your street looks the same, when your walls are made from bricks identical to everyone else's, it becomes harder to build a unique identity that stands apart from the community or challenges its norms. Your personal space is pre-approved. This architectural standardization was a gentle, pervasive form of social engineering. It cultivated a mindset where fitting in, following the pattern, was the natural order of things. The grand temple or palace, unique and awe-inspiring, reminded everyone of the singular source of power and favor. The standardized house reminded you of your place within the system. It was a world where both your ration of bread and the door to your home told you who you were. But if this drive for order was so effective, so embedded in bricks and blueprints, why did these meticulously planned civilizations not last forever? What cracks eventually appeared in their perfect, uniform walls? The perfect brick and the standard measure created an orderly world of things, but people remained unpredictable. How could a ruler impose the same uniformity on human actions, on conflict and justice itself? The answer was etched in stone. Written law codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon, represent the ultimate extension of this logic, an attempt to standardize human behavior itself. Before such codes, justice was often local, personal, and variable. A dispute in one village might be settled by a tribal elder based on custom, while a similar case in the next town could have a completely different outcome. This inconsistency was a source of weakness for a growing kingdom. Hammurabi's innovation was to declare a single, universal set of rules for all his subjects. Carved onto a towering black stone stele for all to see, the code listed 282 laws covering everything from property and trade to family and personal injury. Its famous principle was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but its true genius was in the specifics. The law did not simply say, "Thou shalt not steal." It stated, for example, that if a man stole an ox, he must pay 30 times its value. If a builder's poorly constructed house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be put to death. These were not suggestions, they were fixed prices for every conceivable social transaction. A broken bone had one cost, a severed limb another, each carefully calibrated to the status of the victim and the perpetrator. This created a staggering predictability. For the first time, any two citizens in a dispute could, in theory, know the exact outcome before they ever approached a judge. The law code acted as a social template, reducing the messy, emotional chaos of human conflict into a standardized ledger of penalties and compensations. It transformed justice from a matter of personal judgment into a matter of administrative calculation. This directly connects to the bureaucratic tablets we discussed earlier. Just as those tablets standardized information, turning grain and sheep into countable units, the law code standardized morality and conflict, turning theft and injury into payable debts. The state was no longer just managing resources, it was managing relationships, attempting to engineer a harmonious society through the rigid application of written rules. The stele showed Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash, framing this legal standardization as a divine mandate, as sacred as the Egyptian pharaoh's duty to uphold Maat. It was a promise of order, a declaration that in this kingdom, even justice would be uniform. Yet this very ambition reveals the tension at the heart of the entire project. Can the infinite complexity of human life ever truly be reduced to a list of standardized fines? But a law code carved in stone cannot capture every whisper in a workshop. While kings and priests imposed order from above, another powerful force was shaping standards from the ground up, in the very places where things were made. This was the world of the craft guild, the family workshop, the master artisan protecting a lifetime of hard-earned knowledge. Here, standardization was not a command, but a currency of trust and reputation. For these communities, a perfect, repeatable product was the signature of their skill, a silent advertisement that traveled far beyond their city walls. Consider the ancient potter working not in a royal factory but in a family compound that had thrown clay for generations. His trade secrets, the precise mix of temper and clay, the exact temperature of the kiln, the designs painted with a steady hand were his inheritance and his livelihood. He might sell his wares at a distant market where no one knew his face. How could he convince a buyer of their quality? He did it through consistency. By producing jars of the same elegant shape, with the same durable glaze and the same reliable capacity year after year, his work became recognizable. Customers learned that a pot with those particular curves and that specific reddish hue came from a trustworthy source. This created a brand long before the word existed. When archaeologists uncover a site, they often identify entire cultures by their ceramic styles, the so-called painted ware or beaker folk. These are not royal edicts, but community-wide standards that emerged organically. A successful style was copied and refined by neighboring workshops, not because a king demanded it, but because it sold. Guilds, where they existed, formalized this process. They were associations of craftsmen, from metalworkers to weavers, who regulated their own trades. They set internal rules for apprenticeship, controlled the use of raw materials, and crucially, enforced quality standards. A blacksmith's guild might decree that every sword of a certain grade must be of a minimum length, weight, and flexibility. This protected the reputation of every member. One smith producing shoddy, brittle blades would undermine the trust in all their work, so the guild became its own enforcer, punishing those who deviated from the collective standard. This was standardization driven by professional pride and economic self-interest. A master carpenter took pride in his joinery fitting perfectly every time, not because a bureaucrat measured it, but because his name was on it. The fine linen from a certain town commanded a higher price precisely because every bolt met an understood, unwritten benchmark of thread count and finish. This bottom-up pressure for quality and uniformity could be just as powerful as any top-down decree from a palace. It complicates our neat narrative of control. It suggests that some of the ancient world's most enduring standards, the shapes of pots, the patterns in cloth, the recipes for bronze, emerged not from fear of punishment, but from a shared desire for excellence and a practical need to thrive in a competitive marketplace. The workshop standard and the royal standard could exist in tension, or they could merge, with the state eventually co-opting the best practices of artisans for its own projects. But this raises a final, haunting question about the limits of any system, whether born in a palace or a pottery shed. What happens when the drive for perfect, efficient order collides with the inevitable, unpredictable chaos of the world itself? Yet even the most perfect system holds a hidden vulnerability. For all their power, these standardized worlds did not last forever. Their decline offers a sobering lesson, a testament to how fragile such order truly is. Look at the Indus Valley civilization. For centuries, its cities hummed with a quiet, almost mechanical precision. Then, around 1300 before the Common Era, that hum began to fade. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were not destroyed in a sudden conquest, but gradually abandoned. As the population dispersed, the institutional knowledge that had maintained their flawless standards began to dissolve. The perfect 4:1 brick ratio, once a universal rule, was forgotten. New settlements built with irregular, hand-shaped bricks. The meticulous street grids and sophisticated drainage systems were no longer replicated. The shared system of weights, so crucial for trade, fell out of use. The civilization did not vanish in a day, but its core operating system, that cultural commitment to uniformity, slowly corrupted and was lost. It was a quiet collapse of an idea. This pattern repeats elsewhere. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, there were periods where the central palace or temple authority weakened, often due to drought, invasion, or internal strife. During these times, the archaeological record shows a noticeable relaxation of standards. Pottery styles become more regional and varied. The once identical administrative tablets show more personal, less formulaic writing. Local governors might issue their own slightly different weight standards, creating confusion in the markets. The grand, state-sponsored construction projects that demanded such precision slow or stop altogether. This tells us something crucial. Standardization was not a self-sustaining force. It was a cultural artifact, a delicate achievement that required constant energy to maintain. It needed a stable, powerful institution, a bureaucracy of scribes, inspectors, and engineers to enforce the templates, to teach the next generation of craftsmen the official cubit, to punish those who deviated from the legal code. When that institutional power fractured, the drive for uniformity often fractured with it. People returned to more local, flexible ways of making and measuring. The system that had made the civilization so efficient and legible to its rulers also made it dependent on those rulers. The uniformity in the bricks was a mirror of the unity in the state. When one crumbled, so too did the other. This reveals the double-edged nature of the entire project. Standardization could build empires, but it could not, by itself, guarantee their immortality. It was a tool of control, not a source of resilience. What endures then is not the perfect brick, but the human impulse that created it. The perfect uniformity we've been describing had its own texture, a human scale. Without micrometers or assembly lines, ancient standardization was a triumph of consistency, not of microscopic precision. Their tolerances were measured in finger widths and breadths of air, not thousandths of an inch. The master brick from Mohenjo-daro might be the template, but the copies made from it would carry the subtle warp of the clay and the uneven heat of the kiln. Their goal was not machine-like perfection, but a reliable, repeatable sameness that worked for their world. So how did they achieve so much with so little? Their toolkit was elegant in its simplicity. For measurement, they relied on the human body and its extensions. The Egyptian royal cubit was based on the length of the forearm from elbow to fingertip. But to standardize it, they made physical copies in stone or wood, the master rods that were distributed. For surveying those vast, perfect city grids, they used knotted ropes. Teams of workers would stretch a long cord between stakes, using the knots to mark equal intervals, employing basic geometry, the 3-4-5 triangle method, to ensure their angles were true right angles. This was mathematics made physical, a rope and peg computer that could lay out an empire. For production, the mold was their greatest amplifier of uniformity. Not just for terracotta warriors, but for everyday objects. Metalworkers used standard-sized clay or stone molds to cast copper ingots, ensuring each lump of raw material traded at a known weight and purity. Potters used slow wheels and guide templates to shape vessels of near-identical proportions. A master carpenter's square and level, made of wood and cord, became the template for every doorframe and roof beam in a housing project. Their ingenuity lay in understanding that you did not need to control every minute action. You just needed to control the template. By standardizing the mold, the measuring cord, and the master weight, they could delegate the work to hundreds of hands and still achieve a cohesive result. The slight variations that remain in the archaeological record are not failures, they are proof of the process. They show us the space between the ideal template and the human hand that executed it. This grounding in material reality makes their achievement more profound, not less. They built worlds of order not with futuristic technology, but with rope, clay, and keen observational intelligence, proving that standardization is first and foremost a state of mind. But that state of mind could also become a cage. The very systems that enabled such monumental achievements raise a difficult question. Did the ancient drive for perfect uniformity, in the end, stifle the spark of creativity? Was there a hidden cultural trade-off between order and innovation? To see this tension, we can look at two very different approaches. Take the formidable, standardized weaponry of early imperial China. The crossbow triggers with their interchangeable parts were a marvel of systematic production, allowing for rapid arming of vast armies. Yet for centuries, the basic design remained remarkably static. The system was optimized for producing a reliable, effective weapon at scale, not for experimenting with radical new forms. Innovation, when it happened, often came from the top down, a state-sponsored project, rather than bubbling up from countless individual artisans tinkering in their workshops. The incentive was to follow the template perfectly, not to deviate from it. Now contrast this with the vibrant, competing city-states of classical Greece. Here you see a dazzling variety in artistic styles, from the severe elegance of early statues to the flowing realism of later ones. Pottery shapes evolved rapidly, and armor, while effective, showed more regional variation. This was a world of fierce competition, not just in war, but in philosophy, art, and craftsmanship. An Athenian potter had to innovate to stand out in a crowded marketplace, to attract patrons who valued unique beauty and technical virtuosity. This environment of artisan-led variability became a hotbed for incremental improvements in everything from metallurgy to shipbuilding. The Greek trireme, the fast warship that secured their naval power, was the result of continuous, competitive tweaking by different maritime powers. This is not to say one civilization was superior, but to highlight a fundamental dynamic. High standardization creates phenomenal efficiency and control, enabling projects of unimaginable scale. But it can also institutionalize technological conservatism. When success is measured by how closely you match the approved model, experimentation looks like failure. When a master craftsman's entire reputation and livelihood are tied to replicating a sacred tradition or a state-mandated design, the risk of trying something new becomes very high. The brilliant system that ensured every brick was identical might also subtly discourage the inventor wondering if a different shape of brick could bear more weight. The societal genius that turned justice into a standardized ledger might hesitate to rewrite a single line. The trade-off is between the power of the collective template and the potential of the individual deviation. One builds empires that last for centuries, the other cultivates flashes of genius that can change the world. The historical record suggests that the most enduring civilizations found a way to balance these forces, to harness the stability of standardization while leaving channels open for the unpredictable currents of human ingenuity. Perhaps the most profound standardization of all occurred not in the marketplace or on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces of the sacred. When a priest in ancient Egypt performed the daily ritual to awaken a temple god, every word, every gesture, every offering had to be exact. A single mispronounced syllable or an incorrectly presented item was not a minor mistake, it was a cosmic danger. This was standardization elevated to a spiritual imperative, where perfect repetition was the very thread that held reality together. Across cultures, the realm of the divine demanded a different kind of precision, one that made the uniformity of bricks look almost casual. In Vedic India, the power of a ritual resided in the flawless, phonetic recitation of hymns passed down orally for centuries. The exact tone, rhythm, and sequence of sounds were considered as vital as the meaning. To alter a single syllable was to break the ritual's connection to the cosmic order, rendering it useless or even harmful. The priests were not performers, they were human instruments, calibrated to reproduce a sacred template with zero deviation. This same principle governed the elaborate journey to the afterlife in Egypt. The spells and instructions inscribed inside a pharaoh's tomb, what we call the pyramid texts and later the Book of the Dead, were not unique compositions. They were a standardized script, a divine checklist for navigating the perils of the underworld. The placement of certain spells, the specific offerings depicted, even the orientation of the body, all followed a strict, evolving canon. A wealthy noble might have a shorter version, but the formulas were the same. The belief was simple, the gods recognized and accepted only the correct forms. This ritual standardization naturally bled into the physical objects used in worship. If a prayer had to be perfect, so too did the vessel that held the sacred oil. Workshops attached to temples produced cult statues, amulets, and ritual tools not as individual works of art, but as identical sacred implements. A bronze statue of a deity, used in temple processions, would be cast from a master mold to ensure its proportions were divinely correct. Thousands of small faience amulets depicting gods or protective symbols like the Eye of Horus were mass-produced in molds, each one a standardized packet of spiritual power meant to be placed within a mummy's wrappings. The motivation here was not efficiency or control, but efficacy. A mistake in a brick could weaken a wall. A mistake in a ritual, it was believed, could weaken the universe. This created a powerful feedback loop. The need for perfect ritual objects drove technical excellence in crafting and metallurgy, as artisans sought to meet the exacting demands of the divine client. At the same time, the mindset of sacred repetition reinforced the cultural value of uniformity in all things. If the gods required perfect copies, then surely the king's administrators should require perfect measures. The sacred template legitimized the secular one. This deep, spiritual root may explain why people in these societies so readily accepted such pervasive standardization in their daily lives. It wasn't just about obeying a ruler, it was about participating in a cosmic order where everything, from the stars to the storage jar, had its proper, repeated place. The ultimate goal was harmony, a world in balance, and that balance was maintained through unwavering repetition. But if the sacred demanded such perfect sameness, where did that leave the individual soul seeking a unique connection? Was there any room for a personal prayer outside the approved script? This spiritual drive for perfect repetition found its ultimate earthly expression in an empire built not just on faith, but on logistics. Centuries after the Indus cities faded, a new power mastered the art of replication on a continental scale, turning standardization into the very glue that held a diverse world together. The Roman Empire did not merely use uniform bricks, it built a uniform reality, a predictable imperial space that could be understood, managed, and controlled from a single city thousands of miles away. Its genius was systemic, creating templates so effective they could be stamped onto the landscape of Britain, North Africa, or the Middle East with relentless consistency. Consider the Roman road. These were not meandering paths worn by feet, but engineered arteries, deliberately laid out and constructed to a standard specification. Their width was often uniform, allowing 2 military carts to pass with ease. Their foundation was a layered masterpiece of rubble, sand, and mortar, topped with fitted stone slabs. A soldier marching from the Rhine to Rome would know exactly what to expect under his sandals, mile after mile. This network was the empire's circulatory system, and its standardized design allowed troops, messages, and goods to flow at unprecedented speeds, binding distant provinces to the heart of power. Where those soldiers stopped, they built another marvel of replication, the castra, or military camp. Every legion, upon halting for the night, would construct a temporary fortress following an identical template. The layout was a perfect rectangle with 2 main streets, the Via Praetoria and Via Principales, intersecting at headquarters. The gates were always in the same positions, the tents for each unit in the same assigned sectors. A soldier transferred from Germany to Egypt could walk into a new camp and instantly know where to find his commander, his quarters, or the infirmary. This was more than convenience, it was a psychological and tactical tool. It turned unfamiliar, potentially hostile territory into a familiar Roman space overnight. The predictability bred efficiency and unit cohesion, making the legion a portable piece of Rome that could be deployed anywhere. But an empire runs on more than soldiers and roads, it runs on commerce and trust. Here, Rome's standardization was perhaps most revolutionary, its currency. Across millions of square miles from Scotland to Syria, people conducted business using the same denarii and sestertii. These coins, minted with the emperor's portrait and standardized weight and purity, were more than money. They were a daily, tangible reminder of imperial authority. A merchant in Londinium could strike a deal with a trader from Alexandria using a mutually understood value without complex barter or suspicion. This unified economic space fueled trade, simplified tax collection, and created a sense of shared participation in a Roman system. The roads, the camps, and the coins were all parts of a single integrated design. The roads moved the troops who built the camps secured the provinces that paid taxes in the coins, and the coins paid for the roads. This self-reinforcing loop of standardized systems allowed Rome to administer a vast collection of cultures and landscapes, not by trying to erase their differences, but by overlaying a consistent, predictable framework of control. A local might worship their own gods and speak their own language, but they paid taxes in Roman coin, traveled on Roman roads, and sought justice, in theory, under Roman law. This framework created a manageable, legible empire. It meant a bureaucrat in Rome could issue an edict with reasonable confidence about how it would be implemented in Gaul, because the mechanisms for implementation, the governors, the legions, the communications network, all operated on the same basic principles. Rome's longevity stemmed from this incredible capacity to replicate itself, to turn the chaos of conquest into the order of administration through a toolkit of relentless, repeatable templates. The empire did not just conquer territory, it installed a software update, and the code was standardization. This capacity to replicate order reached its zenith in a civilization that never saw a wheeled cart or read a written word. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire constructed a logistical masterpiece that rivaled Rome's, proving the drive for standardized control is a universal human impulse, not a technological one. Their tool was the road, but these were not mere paths. The Inca built over 25,000 miles of standardized highway, traversing some of the planet's most extreme terrain, from coastal deserts to cloud forests to icy mountain passes over 15,000 feet high. To walk this network was to experience a world made uniform by imperial will. The roads followed regulated widths, often paved with stone, and featured consistent stairways cut into cliff faces and drainage channels to manage the torrential rains. At precise, standardized intervals, a traveler would find a tambo, a way station. These were not unique inns but replicated modules of imperial hospitality and control, each one providing identical rest, storage, and supplies for the relay runners who carried messages across the empire at breathtaking speed. The most awe-inspiring standardized features were the suspension bridges. Deep river gorges were spanned by cables woven from mountain grass, rebuilt by local communities to the same specifications each year in a collective duty. The design was so reliable, so uniform, that some of these bridges remained in use for centuries. This physical network created a predictable, legible space across a fractured geography. But a road is useless without information. Here, the Incas performed their greatest innovation. Without a writing system based on symbols, they developed the quipu, a complex device of knotted cords. The quipu was a portable, standardized database. The colors of the cords, the positions of the knots, and the types of knots all held specific, agreed-upon meanings. Through this system, administrators could record census data, track warehouse inventories across thousands of tambos, and organize the mita, the empire's mandatory labor tax. A quipu from a distant province could be sent to the capital, Cusco, and read by a specialized class of record keepers, translating the complexity of the realm, its people, its llama herds, its grain stores into a manageable, uniform code. This combination of the physical road and the informational quipu allowed the Inca state to achieve a staggering level of logistical control. They could mobilize tens of thousands of workers for projects, redistribute food from surplus to deficit regions, and deploy armies rapidly without a single sheet of parchment or a coined currency. Their standardization was woven into the landscape and knotted into strings, a testament to the fact that the essence of this order is not in the medium clay, stone, or rope, but in the mindset. It reveals a profound truth. A society does not need an alphabet to impose a system. It simply needs a shared template and the collective will to follow it, from the width of a step to the tie of a knot. That shared template, woven into roads and knotted into cords, did more than move armies and grain. It began to reshape the minds of those who lived within it. This is the subtle, powerful psychological dimension of standardization. When every brick, every coin, and every market weight conforms to a universal rule, something profound happens to a society's shared reality. The external order of the world gradually becomes the internal order of thought. Think of the mental effort involved in a simple transaction without standards. You bring your pottery to a market in a town you have never visited. The local merchant uses a different-sized bowl to measure grain, a different weight for silver, and the streets are a confusing maze. Every exchange requires negotiation, suspicion, and complex mental calculation. It is a world of high cognitive load, where simply buying bread demands constant vigilance and adaptation. Now step into the Roman Empire or the Inca realm at its height. Your Roman denarius is accepted without question. The measure for olive oil is the same amphora you used back home. The road into town follows a predictable, straight course to the forum. This predictability is a kind of cognitive gift. It frees the mind from constant negotiation over basic realities. You can think about the price of the olives, not whether the merchant's scale is honest. You can plan a journey based on known distances between way stations, not on rumors about impassable trails. This reduction of daily friction creates a profound sense of psychological ease. The world feels knowable, manageable, and fair, at least in a material sense. But this comfort comes with a subtle, powerful side effect. When the state's order becomes the backdrop of everyday life, it starts to feel less like an imposition and more like the natural state of things. The uniform coin in your palm is not just currency. It is a tiny, daily lesson in belonging. It whispers that you are part of a system that transcends your village, a system that works the same way for everyone. The repetitive architecture of your housing block, the familiar layout of the military camp on the hill, these visual cues reinforce a common identity. You are not just a person from Gaul or a villager from the Andes. You are someone who navigates a Roman street or rests at an Inca tambo. This shared mental landscape, built from 1,000 standardized touchpoints, fosters a powerful social cohesion. People begin to trust the system, and by extension, the authority that guarantees it. Disputes can be settled by reference to a known law or measure, not by brute force or clan loyalty. The central power becomes the indispensable referee and guarantor of this predictable reality. In this way, standardization performs its most enduring act of control. It does not just command obedience through fear, it earns compliance by making life simpler and more secure. It aligns individual self-interest with the stability of the state. To challenge the system is not just to challenge a king. It is to risk returning to that more chaotic, exhausting world of endless negotiation and uncertainty. The ruler's order comes to feel inevitable, even righteous, because it is literally built into the streets you walk, the money you spend, and the very vessels you eat from. This psychological embedding is why these systems could be so stable for centuries. The control was not just in the legion's sword, but in the citizen's mind, comforted by the reliable weight of a coin and the straight line of a road leading home. Yet this very comfort prompts a final, reflective question for us today. living in a world more standardized than any emperor could have dreamed. When we design our own systems for perfect efficiency and seamless experience, what shared reality are we constructing, and what unseen boundaries are we quietly accepting as the natural order of things? The silent testimony of bricks and roads is only half the story. To hear it, we need the tools of modern archaeology, a forensic science that decodes the intentions of the past from the smallest physical traces. How can we be so certain that a basket of clay fragments represents a deliberate system, and not just a lucky coincidence? The answer lies in a meticulous process of measurement, mapping, and statistical reasoning that turns scattered artifacts into a compelling argument for ancient order. The first step is often the simplest, a ruler. Archaeologists will gather hundreds, sometimes thousands, of similar objects from a site, say, those iconic Indus Valley bricks or a cache of Roman roof tiles. They measure each one, recording length, width, and thickness. Alone, a few similar measurements might mean nothing, but when you plot all those measurements on a graph, a pattern emerges. If the bricks were made freely, you would expect a wide, scattered spread of sizes, a bell curve of natural variation. What researchers consistently find is a dramatic spike on the graph. The vast majority of bricks cluster tightly around a single set of dimensions, with only minimal deviation. This statistical fingerprint is the hallmark of a standard. It reveals a target size that workers were consciously aiming for, a template held in the mind or physically present at the worksite. The evidence becomes even clearer when we examine the objects themselves under magnification. The marks of their creation tell a story. A pot thrown entirely by hand on a slow wheel will show subtle, unique spirals and pressure points, but a pot made using a mold or shaped against a standardized template will bear different tells. You might find a consistent seam line, a uniform thinness in the walls, or tool marks that repeat in the same pattern on every piece. For metal objects, like those Qin dynasty arrowheads, analysis can reveal they were cast in identical, multi-part molds, leaving matching flaws and flow lines. These physical signatures are the ancient equivalent of a manufacturer's stamp. Beyond the objects, there is the grand pattern of the city itself. Here, archaeology borrows from cartography and geometry. Using precise surveying equipment, researchers map the foundations of an ancient settlement. When they overlay this map with a grid, the intentionality can be breathtaking. Streets in Mohenjo-daro or in Roman colonial towns align to cardinal directions with a precision that rules out chance. The right angles are too perfect, the block size is too repetitive. This isn't organic growth, it is design, frozen in stone and soil. Perhaps the most fascinating insight comes not from the sameness, but from the tiny deviations within it. Let's return to our graph of brick sizes. While most cluster tightly, a few will always fall outside the main group. To an untrained eye, these might be mistakes. To an archaeologist, they are clues. A small, distinct cluster of slightly larger bricks might indicate a different work gang using their own, slightly off copy of the master template. A group of bricks with a unique mineral signature, identified through chemical analysis, could point to a separate workshop using different clay sources but still following the official size decree. These subtle variations within a standardized system allow researchers to trace production across a city, identify different artisan communities, and even spot changes over time, like the gradual drift in a standard as institutional memory fades after the collapse of a central authority. This toolkit transforms a pile of broken pottery into a data set, and a city's rubble into a blueprint of social control. It moves us from speculation to evidence, proving that the order we perceive was not imposed by our modern imagination, but was a tangible, governing reality for those who lived within it. The patterns are real, measured, and mapped, but this very precision forces us to confront a deeper, more philosophical puzzle. If these societies could conceive and execute such brilliant systems of material order, why did they seemingly ignore the chaotic, unpredictable realm of nature itself? But this mastery over the man-made world stands in stark contrast to a civilization that thrived on a different principle entirely. While empires from the Indus to the Andes were imposing grand templates, another culture on the shores of the Mediterranean was weaving a different kind of order, one that celebrated variation and local genius. The ancient Greek world, for all its philosophical rigor and military discipline, largely rejected the kind of top-down urban standardization we have been exploring. Their cities did not spring from a central planner's drawing board. Instead, they grew like living things, adapting to the dramatic landscapes they occupied. Athens, the shining star of the classical age, was a labyrinth of winding, narrow streets that followed the natural contours of the Acropolis rock. There was no grand grid, no uniform housing blocks. The agora, its public heart, was an open space defined by a haphazard collection of temples, stoas, and administrative buildings added over centuries, each in its own style and on its own timeline. This organic, seemingly chaotic layout was not a sign of primitiveness, but a reflection of a different social and political reality. Greek city-states or polis were fiercely independent entities, often governed by their own citizens in assemblies rather than by a distant, autocratic ruler. Urban planning was a local affair responding to immediate needs, the lay of the land, and the patronage of wealthy individuals who might fund a new temple or a stoa, placing it where space and prestige allowed. The result was a city that felt human in scale, full of surprising vistas and intimate corners where public life unfolded in adaptable, multi-use spaces rather than along rigid, predetermined avenues. This lack of physical standardization mirrored a cultural value placed on individual and civic expression. In the realm of art, this becomes even clearer. Look at the vibrant frescoes of the earlier Minoan civilization on Crete. Unlike the repetitive cult statues of Egypt, Minoan wall paintings burst with life and individuality. The famous bull-leaping fresco captures a moment of dynamic motion and risk. The Prince of the Lilies presents a figure of stylized but unique grace. While certain themes recur, each fresco is a distinct composition, full of flowing lines, naturalistic details, and a joyful, almost spontaneous energy. This suggests a society where artistic skill was directed toward capturing a moment's beauty or a narrative's drama, not toward replicating a sanctioned, sacred form. The contrast forces a vital realization. The drive for extreme uniformity was not an inevitable stage of development, a necessary step on the ladder of progress. It was a deliberate cultural and political choice, one answer to the problem of how to organize a complex society. The Greek model, with its embrace of organic growth and artistic individuality, offered another, equally sophisticated answer. Their choice stemmed from a different set of priorities, values that elevated local autonomy, civic participation, and the celebration of human achievement in its diverse forms. Their power came not from a system that made every citizen a replaceable part, but from a competitive spirit that encouraged excellence, debate, and innovation. This tells us that the ancient world was a laboratory of social ideas. Some cultures found strength and stability in sameness, building systems where every brick confirmed the whole. Others found vitality and resilience in variation, building communities where every temple and every painting could be a testament to a unique moment or a local identity. One was not inherently more advanced than the other. They were different solutions to the eternal human challenge of living together. So if standardization was just one option among many, why did it prove so powerfully attractive to so many emerging empires? What deep-seated human need does a perfect, predictable system ultimately fulfill? The Greeks celebrated the unique, but their world remained one of artisans and city-states. Our modern age of global uniformity seems to belong to a different universe entirely, forged in the fire and steam of the Industrial Revolution. Yet here lies the most important distinction of all. The revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries was not the invention of the standardized idea. That blueprint was ancient, written in brick and clay thousands of years earlier. The true breakthrough was a radical shift in the means of production, a new kind of precision that transformed what standardization could achieve. For the first time, the goal was not just uniform output, but perfectly interchangeable parts. This is the subtle but monumental difference between a society that makes 1,000,000 similar bricks and one that builds 1,000,000 identical watches, where any tiny gear from one can fit flawlessly into another. Ancient workshops standardized the final product, the jar or the spearhead. The modern factory, powered by machine tools like the lathe and the milling machine, standardized the very process of creation, and in doing so, standardized the components themselves. This mechanical precision, measured in thousandths of an inch rather than finger widths, unlocked a new paradigm, the assembly line. Now, a complex object like a rifle or an automobile could be assembled by workers who did not need to be master craftsmen. They simply attached parts that were guaranteed to fit, because those parts were made by machines following a single, unerring digital or mechanical template. This leap from standardizing things to standardizing processes is what enabled the dizzying scale and speed of the modern world. It is the foundation of our global supply chains, where a component made on one continent is shipped across an ocean to snap perfectly into place on an assembly line on another. The ancient Indus Valley trader would recognize the principle of a reliable weight, but the reality of a smartphone, assembled from parts sourced from dozens of countries, each to a microscopic tolerance, would seem like magic. The Industrial Revolution did not give us the dream of order. It gave us the tools to build that dream on a planetary scale, with a consistency that finally matched the ambition of the pharaohs and the emperors who came before. The materials themselves whispered what kind of order was possible. Before any king issued a decree for uniformity, the very substance in the artisan's hands set the boundaries of what could be replicated. Clay, stone, and bronze each offered a different conversation between human will and physical law, guiding ancient societies toward distinct forms of standardization. The humble mud brick, the foundation of so many planned cities, reveals this relationship perfectly. Clay is a forgiving plastic medium. It wants to take a shape and hold it. You can press a carved seal into its soft surface, leaving a perfect, repeatable impression for an administrative tablet. You can form it around a wooden mold to create a brick of exact dimensions, and then fire it in a kiln to make that shape permanent. This fundamental property made clay the perfect partner for bureaucratic and architectural control. The countless identical tablets of Mesopotamia and the perfectly proportioned bricks of the Indus Valley were not just products of a strict society, they were expressions of the material's innate potential for replication. Even small cult figurines, like the Egyptian Ushabtis, could be mass-produced by the thousands using simple, two-part molds, creating a uniform army for the afterlife from a single template pressed into wet clay. The medium invited standardization. Stone, however, tells a different story. It is a narrative of resistance. To shape stone is a subtractive process. You begin with a block and you chip, grind, and polish away everything that is not the intended form. This makes exact duplication incredibly difficult. While a master sculptor could create a series of similar statues, perhaps for a temple colonnade, each one would carry the unique marks of the hammer and chisel, slight variations in proportion or detail born from the moment of creation. You cannot stamp stone like clay. This inherent uniqueness is why, even in the most rigid empires, stone sculpture often retained an element of individual artistry. The famous portrait busts of Roman emperors, while following a standardized iconography to project a consistent imperial image, were each carved separately by skilled hands. The material itself pushed back against perfect sameness, ensuring that even symbols of absolute power bore the faint, human signature of the craft. Standardization in stone was achieved more in the grand design, the repeating column capitals of a temple, than in the microscopic precision of each component. Then there is bronze, a material that bridges these worlds. In ancient China, the casting of bronze ritual vessels became a high art of controlled replication. The technique, known as the piece mold method, was a marvel of pre-industrial engineering. Artisans would first create a clay model of the desired vessel with all its intricate designs. This model was then used to create sectional clay molds. These molds could be used to cast multiple identical vessels, but the system's true genius lay in its modularity. Decorative elements like the iconic Tauti masks could be created as standard units and applied to different vessel shapes. This allowed for both breathtaking complexity and systematic production. The result was a world of sacred objects, like the majestic Ding cauldrons, that were both profoundly standardized in their symbolic language and technical execution, yet could be combined in unique sets for different rituals or noble lineages. The bronze itself, flowing liquid into a waiting mold, captured every detail of the template, then solidified into a permanent, unyielding copy. This process gave rulers and priests a powerful tool, the ability to produce not just one sacred object, but a series of them, each one a perfect conduit for communicating with the ancestors, each one reinforcing the same ritual order through its identical form. So when we look at the archaeological record and see a stunning uniformity in clay bricks but more variation in stone reliefs, we are not just seeing cultural choices. We are witnessing a deep collaboration with the material world. The ancient drive for order had to work with what the earth provided, bending clay to its will, negotiating with stubborn stone, and mastering the liquid metal that could freeze a perfect template for eternity. This material logic shaped their physical and spiritual landscapes in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. That flawless brick did not lay itself. The grand systems of the ancient world, those grids and monuments of perfect order, rested on a foundation far more complex than clay or stone. They were built by people, vast numbers of them, organized into a human machinery whose efficiency was as carefully designed as the products of their labor. To manage projects of such staggering scale, authorities developed sophisticated systems for mobilizing and controlling the workforce, often drawing a stark line between the minds that designed the template and the hands that executed it. One of the most widespread systems was the Corvée, a form of labor tax. In places like ancient Egypt or among the Inca, every household owed a certain number of days of work to the state each year. This was not necessarily permanent slavery, but a mandatory service. When the Nile's floodwaters receded and farming was impossible, the pharaoh's administrators would call up these labor crews by the thousands. They were put to work quarrying stone, hauling blocks, or building the ramps for pyramids. The system was brilliantly efficient for the state, converting idle time into monumental construction. The workers were fed from state granaries housed in standardized camps like Deir el-Medina, and their labor was a duty, a payment rendered not in grain but in sweat. This was labor managed as a resource, as predictable and schedulable as any other commodity in the royal ledger. For even larger, more permanent projects or for tasks deemed especially harsh, states often relied on enslaved populations. Captives taken in war or people enslaved through debt or other means provided a controllable, permanent workforce. Their lives were fully directed by the state or by temple authorities. In Mesopotamia, vast herds of enslaved individuals labored on massive irrigation projects, digging and maintaining the canals that made agriculture possible in the arid plains. Their work was unending, and their existence was a line item in an administrative tablet, a cost measured in daily rations of barley and oil. The Roman Empire's infamous ergastula, underground prison workshops for the enslaved, speak to a system where human beings were treated as interchangeable components in agricultural and industrial production. The common thread in all these systems, whether corvée, conscription, or slavery, was control. A massive, complex project like a pyramid or a 25,000-mile road network cannot rely on volunteers or freelance artisans. It requires a workforce that appears when commanded, follows instructions without question, and remains on task for months or years. Standardization was the key that made this possible on a managerial level. By breaking down a monumental task into thousands of tiny, repetitive, and standardized actions, the need for skilled decision-making at the individual level was minimized. Think of dressing a stone block for a pyramid. A master sculptor does not need to carve each one. Instead, the process is broken down. One crew quarries rough blocks using standardized wooden wedges and water. Another crew transports them on standardized sledges. At the site, another group does the initial shaping with heavy stone hammers to a rough size. Then the final dressing is done by workers who do just one thing. They rub the surface of the block with a smoother stone or a slurry of abrasive sand, following guide marks painted on the surface, until it is perfectly flat and ready to be set in place. Each worker performs a simple, repeatable task. They do not need to understand the grand architectural plan, only the specific, standardized action assigned to them. This is the true engine behind the scenes. The invention of the standard brick was not just an architectural innovation, it was a managerial one. When every brick is identical, the act of bricklaying becomes a mindless, repeatable process. A supervisor can assign a team to a section of wall, and every worker, regardless of their individual skill level, knows exactly what to do. Pick up a brick, apply mortar, set it down, check the alignment with a string line, repeat. The complexity is absorbed by the system's design, not by the worker's intellect. This principle turned human labor into a predictable, scalable input. It allowed a relatively small number of literate engineers and scribes to direct the work of tens of thousands, transforming chaotic human effort into a coherent, productive machine. The awe we feel before these ancient wonders is therefore dual-edged. It is admiration for the visionary design, but it is also, unavoidably, a recognition of the immense human effort so meticulously organized and so relentlessly expended. The silent, perfect order of the finished product often speaks louder than the vanished voices of those who built it, their individual stories dissolved into the collective achievement, their labor standardized long before their lives ever could be. That relentless drive to break down monumental tasks into simple, repeatable actions did not vanish with the ancient empires. It re-emerged with startling clarity at the dawn of our own industrial age. In the early 20th century, an American engineer named Frederick Taylor published a revolutionary idea he called scientific management. His goal was to eliminate waste and maximize efficiency in factories. Taylor's method was to study workers with a stopwatch, timing their every movement, then prescribing the one best way to perform each task. He sought to standardize not just the product, but the human body itself, turning the worker into a predictable, optimized component of the production machine. This philosophy, known as Taylorism, promised a new era of prosperity through total efficiency. But listen to its principles, and you hear a very old echo. The ancient Egyptian overseer breaking down pyramid construction into specialized, repetitive steps. The Roman legionary trained to perform drills with identical precision. The Inca administrator organizing labor through the mita system. These were all experiments in applying systems thinking to human society. They were attempts to control, predict, and optimize collective activity for a grander purpose. whether that purpose was a pharaoh's immortality, imperial stability, or cosmic harmony. Taylorism, for all its modern tools and time studies, was not an entirely new invention. It was the latest expression of a timeless impulse, the desire to impose a legible, manageable order upon the beautiful, frustrating complexity of human effort. The ancient world did not have stopwatches or flowcharts, but it possessed the same foundational insight that to achieve something vast, you must first reduce it to a series of small, standardized, and controllable parts. This reframes those early cities and empires not as primitive precursors, but as pioneering laboratories of social engineering. They were applying a form of systems thinking to entire civilizations, using standardization as the core algorithm to run the software of the state. Their bricks and roads were the hardware, but the real innovation was the operating system, a set of rules designed to make millions of individual wills function as a single, coordinated entity. When we look at a Taylorist factory manual or a modern corporate flowchart, we are seeing the philosophical descendant of the Indus Valley's weight system or the meticulous ledger of a Mesopotamian scribe. The tools have evolved from clay tablets to digital spreadsheets, but the underlying quest remains eerily familiar: to create a world so well-ordered, so perfectly calibrated, that human variability becomes not a source of creativity, but a manageable error in the system. This lineage forces us to ask a difficult question about progress. If the logic of our modern, hyper-efficient world shares a direct lineage with the logic of ancient granaries and labor gangs, what have we truly perfected? And what enduring human costs, so visible in the dust of those old worker villages, might still be woven into the fabric of our own streamlined lives? The perfect grid and the identical brick present a puzzle modern archaeology is still piecing together. We can measure the astonishing consistency, but interpreting the social mind that created it leads us into a realm of vibrant, ongoing debate. The most profound mystery is not the what but the who and the how. Take the Indus Valley civilization, that sprawling network of standardized cities. The material evidence points to a stunningly unified culture, yet archaeologists have found no obvious palaces, no grand royal tombs filled with treasure, and no monuments celebrating warrior kings. This absence forces a fundamental question. Was this uniformity the product of a powerful, centralized state, an ancient bureaucracy issuing decrees that echoed across hundreds of miles? Or was it something else entirely, a shared cultural ideology so strong that communities voluntarily adhered to the same templates without the need for a single, overarching ruler? Some researchers point to the consistency itself as proof of a strong central authority, one that managed resources, trained inspectors, and enforced standards. Others propose a model of peer-polity interaction, where independent city-states, through trade and shared values, consciously copied each other's successful practices, creating a voluntary consensus on what a proper city should be. The debate hinges on how we define power. Must it always be personified in a king, or can it reside in a universally accepted idea of order? Then there is the practical puzzle of communication. Without a fast communication system, how did a brickmaker in a distant settlement know the exact 4-to-1 ratio? There were no royal couriers racing with blueprints. The answer likely lies in the mobility of people, not messages. Itinerant master craftsmen trained in the major centers may have traveled between settlements, carrying the knowledge of the standard in their heads and hands. Perhaps apprentice builders from outlying towns traveled to Mohenjo-daro to learn, returning home as guardians of the correct form. The standard itself became the message, replicated through practice and apprenticeship, a viral idea spreading through shared craftsmanship rather than imperial decree. This leads to the most human question of all, the nature of compliance. To what extent did people willingly embrace this uniformity, and where was coercion applied? Building a city is one thing, but maintaining its standards across generations is another. The remarkable cleanliness of the streets and the functioning of the drains in Indus cities suggest a high degree of communal buy-in, a shared pride in their orderly world. People likely saw the benefits, the fairness in standardized weights at the market, the public health provided by the drainage system. Compliance may have been largely cultural, a matter of doing things the right way because that was simply how things were done. Yet, the scale of planning implies some level of social coordination that would have required mechanisms for resolving disputes and ensuring communal labor for projects like city walls or granaries. Even without evidence of a standing army, social pressure, religious sanction, or the authority of elders and guilds could have enforced the norms. The silent artifacts do not tell us if a potter who made a non-standard jar was fined, shamed, or simply found that no one would buy his wares. Archaeology gives us the pattern, but the texture of daily life, the balance between voluntary participation and subtle social enforcement, remains just out of reach. These are not just academic questions, they force us to reconsider what holds a complex society together. Is it the threat of force from the top, or the pull of a shared vision from within? The ruins of these early cities offer evidence for both interpretations, a reminder that the clearest material patterns can still veil the most profound human complexities. These threads of debate all weave toward a single, undeniable conclusion. Standardization was not a random cultural quirk or an isolated technical achievement. It was a fundamental, repeatable response to a specific set of challenges that emerged whenever human societies crossed a critical threshold of complexity. The pattern emerges clearly across continents and millennia. First, you see the consolidation of power into a centralized state, whether embodied in a pharaoh, a temple bureaucracy, or a council of elders. This new authority now faces the monumental task of managing not just a village, but a city, a region, or an empire. It must feed thousands, coordinate labor for irrigation or defense, extract taxes, and project its power across vast distances. In a world without engines, telecommunications, or digital databases, how do you solve these problems? The answer, perfected independently from the Indus to the Andes, was standardization. It was the primary operating system for early complex society. By making things the same, you made them manageable. A uniform brick simplified construction into a repeatable task, enabling projects of staggering scale. A standard weight and measure turned the chaotic bounty of the harvest into countable, taxable units, filling state granaries. A written legal code following a rigid formula attempted to replace the unpredictability of personal vengeance with a predictable, administrative justice. Even the layout of a workers' village with its identical houses made the population itself more legible, easier to survey and control. This drive was amplified by specific ambitions, the desire to build a pyramid that would touch the heavens, to equip an army that could conquer neighbors, or to create a road network that could bind a continent. These were not goals achievable by loose collections of individual artisans. They required the synchronization of thousands of wills, and standardization provided the rhythm. But perhaps the most powerful catalyst was ideological, a worldview that saw perfect order as a sacred or political ideal. For the Egyptians, it was Ma'at, the cosmic harmony maintained through ritual repetition. For others, it might have been a belief that social stability itself depended on everyone knowing and keeping their precisely defined place, a place reflected in the uniform size of their home and the fixed portion of their grain ration. In every case, standardization served as a lever of control. It allowed a relatively small group of rulers, priests, and scribes to exert influence over geography, resources, and human activity on a scale that would otherwise be impossible. It was a technology of power crafted not from silicon or steel, but from social agreement and enforced practice. The perfect brick, the sealed measure, the grid of streets, these were the tools that built the first worlds of monumental order, proving that long before the factory, the most complex machine humans ever learned to operate was society itself. This realization shatters a comfortable but misleading story we often tell ourselves. For centuries, the narrative of human progress has been depicted as a straight line, moving from simple, primitive societies toward our complex, advanced modernity. In this view, concepts like mass production, systematic planning, and bureaucratic control are seen as inventions of the industrial age, markers that separate us from our ancient ancestors. The evidence of early standardization completely upends this linear model. It proves that what we consider modern is, in many ways, profoundly ancient. These societies were not primitive versions of us, waiting to discover the right technology. They were sophisticated innovators who solved the problems of complexity with a different toolkit entirely. Their machinery was not made of iron and steam, but of social agreement, ritual practice, and administrative genius. They achieved a level of order and coordination that we, even with all our digital tools, would find staggeringly difficult to replicate without our own technological crutches. This forces a vital shift in perspective. We must stop seeing history as a single ladder with some cultures higher up than others. Instead, we should see it as a vast, branching tree, with different civilizations exploring diverse pathways to managing large-scale human life. One branch pursued technological invention, leading eventually to engines and computers. Another branch, exemplified by the Indus Valley or the Inca, mastered the art of social and bureaucratic systems, achieving monumental results through unparalleled human organization. Their advancement was not measured in horsepower, but in the quiet, relentless efficiency of a system that could feed a city, build a road for thousands of miles, or keep 1,000,000 bricks identical, all through the power of shared norms and meticulous management. To call such societies primitive is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of their achievement. They were not less advanced, they were advanced in a different dimension. They built cathedrals of social order where every person was a carefully placed stone. This reframing is not just about giving credit to the past, it is about humility in the present. It asks us to consider what unique forms of intelligence our own reliance on technology might be blinding us to. If they could orchestrate such harmony without a single spreadsheet, what does that say about the potential of the human collective mind? And what forgotten lessons about building resilient, coordinated societies might be waiting for us, encoded in the silent geometry of their perfect, ancient grids? So the story of standardization is not a march from primitive to modern, but a recurring human refrain. Across deserts and mountains, from the Indus to the Andes, early complex societies discovered the same powerful principle. When you want to manage something vast, you begin by making it the same. This was the operating system of the first empires, the silent logic behind the grandest monuments and the most humble market weights. It was a tool for feeding cities, building roads that spanned continents, and turning the chaotic flow of human life into a legible, manageable ledger. These civilizations reveal a profound and timeless capacity within us, the ability to step back from the world's beautiful messiness and impose a template of our own design. They prove that the drive for order is not a symptom of the machine age, but a fundamental expression of the collective human mind when faced with the challenge of scale. Yet every tool has its weight, and this one is double-edged. The same systems that enabled breathtaking cooperation and stability often required the smoothing out of individual variants. The perfect brick meant less room for the artisan's unique flourish. The standardized law code sought to replace personal stories with fixed penalties. The housing block built for efficiency could also build a mindset of conformity. This is the enduring tension at the heart of our story. Standardization enables the collective project, the city, the empire, the civilization that endures for centuries. But it can also subtly privilege the system over the spark, the template over the experiment. It is a bargain societies have struck again and again, trading a measure of spontaneous variety for the power of predictable order. The next time you walk down a straight street, use a coin, or follow a set of instructions, remember you are participating in a ritual of order that is thousands of years old. Look around at the modern world, so meticulously arranged for our convenience, and ask yourself a final question. What other supposedly modern ideas, what other pillars of our streamlined lives, might we find waiting for us in the dust of an ancient city, if only we know how to look?